Section 1. First, you have some time to look at questions 1 to 5. Now we shall begin. You should answer the questions as you listen, because you will not hear the recording a second time. Listen carefully and answer questions 1 to 5.
Thank you very much for inviting me here today. I understand that you all own your own home, and some of you may be interested in buying additional property here in the city, so I hope you will find the information I am going to share with you useful and informative. I'm going to talk about the situation with property here in the city. The city centre of any area is obviously going to have the highest prices, and as more and more people are competing for houses in this area, both renting and buying are becoming increasingly difficult. It is most people's dream to one day own their own house. House ownership gives us a feeling of having achieved something, and we can see clearly what we have worked so hard for all our lives. It can give us a sense of security for our old age, and a knowledge that we will hopefully have something to pass on to our children. However, buying a house, particularly for first-time buyers, is becoming more and more difficult, not only due to increasing prices, but also because of the need for a substantial deposit. For younger people, buying their first home is very difficult and often impossible. Young couples who cannot get the deposit together need to rent for a long time and sometimes forever. While traditionally, homes near the centre of the city have been the most desirable, people are now looking further afield. This has happened for a number of reasons, the main one being that our style of work is changing, along with that of other countries such as the USA. In certain professions, for example sales and computing, it is no longer necessary for people to be based in an office full-time. More and more people are beginning to work from home, which means they can avoid the hustle and bustle of rush hour traffic jams into work, and have more freedom to choose to live in a more rural and peaceful location. My company deals with finding property for both purchasers and renters in the city area. One of my main roles within the company is to find investment properties for people who wish to plan ahead for their future.
Before you hear the rest of the conversation, you have some time to look at questions 6 to 10. Now listen and answer questions 6 to 10.
The layout I've just described will give you a better idea as to the design of a medieval castle. There was no blueprint for castles though, and the design and layout of each castle was determined greatly by local demands, function and purpose for which the fortification was intended. What we see in the castle design here is an advance on earlier medieval designs. Those medieval castles that predated this one had very basic residential and living areas. In such castles, the main focal point was the keep, rather than the great hall and great chambers, as in later years. Little more than a fortified tower, the keep doubled up as basic accommodation for the castle's residents. As the years passed, the living areas became more luxurious, evolving into separate buildings. Confusingly, the keep was known as a donjon, meaning fortified tower in French. The term dungeon was only used in later years to refer to underground prisons. In fact, at the time when the keep dominated castle affairs, the use of latter-day dungeons for imprisonment was an unknown and alien concept. the judicial systems favouring more physical forms of punishment instead. Another dissimilarity between earlier and later medieval castles was in their fortification. A moat, fortified walls and a barbican were typical features of most castles. However, it was recognised with the passage of time that the narrow fortified entrance of the barbican was insufficient defence against an enemy intent on invading the castle. As a result, extra, more reliable fortifications were added in the form of a portcullis and a drawbridge. The portcullis was a spiked metal gate that could be dropped vertically down from under the gatehouse, thereby sealing off the inner castle entrance from the outside world. To protect the main castle entrance further, a drawbridge was placed in front of the portcullis. This was a retractable bridge between the gatehouse and the outside area of the castle. However, the portcullis always remained the last line of defence against the enemy.
That is the end of section 1. You now have half a minute to check your answers. Now turn to section 2. Section 2. First, you have some time to look at questions 11 to 15. Now listen carefully and answer questions 11 to 15.
That was an interesting lecture.
I'm glad you thought so.
Yes, it made a break from the usual lectures on literary style. Certainly made me look at some of Shakespeare's plays like Hamlet and the playwright himself in a new light.
Me too. I always thought that Shakespeare believed in the supernatural, and that was the reason why so many of his plays, like Hamlet and Macbeth, featured a ghost.
What you thought is a common misconception. However, when you think about it, it was unlikely that Shakespeare would have been sympathetic to a belief in ghosts.
Why?
Well, he was Protestant, as was his audience, and the Protestant religion did not subscribe to a belief in ghosts as spirits returning from another world. Also, Hamlet was set in Denmark, and, although fictional, the play would have reflected the Protestant beliefs of the Danes too.
So, the main religion in England at the time was Protestantism.
Very much so. Any other religions like Catholicism were not tolerated by the religious authorities or James I, who was head of the Church of England at the time.
What did the Catholics believe about ghosts?
Their religion was compatible with a belief in the spirit world, as it were. Ghosts were seen as lost souls that were in purgatory, that is to say, a state between heaven and hell.
So it was obvious, really, that Shakespeare incorporated ghosts into his play for other reasons, right?
Absolutely. It's certainly odd to write about something you really don't believe in and then ask the audience to believe in it. So yes, there was clearly another motive.
I guess when you think about it, it's quite apparent. As you mentioned in the lecture, ghosts appear in Macbeth and Hamlet really to show what the characters are thinking and as a catalyst for certain events.
Quite right.
And I think it's quite plain that Shakespeare had no belief in the supernatural. The fact that the ghosts seen by Macbeth and Hamlet are only often either visible to themselves or speak only to them suggests that the ghosts are only as real as the imagination of those who see them.
So, would you say that the audience was as sceptical as Shakespeare with regard to ghosts?
Well, as you know, the official line would have been that they didn't believe in ghosts, as it was not in line with Protestant beliefs prevalent at the time. Nevertheless, contrary to expectations, they do seem to have been a superstitious lot. Belief in witches and astrology were common back then, but how they justified their beliefs in religious terms is quite a mystery.
Before you hear the rest of the talk, you have some time to look at questions 16 to 20. Now listen and answer questions 16 to 20.
Well, I hope you all found the tour interesting. If any of you would like to become a patron of the museum, you can request information from the museum store. Being a patron entitles you to special discounts on visiting exhibitions and first refusal on tickets to special events. You will also be the first to know about our museum events, as you are automatically placed on the museum's mailing list. You can choose to become a gold, silver or bronze patron of the museum. Gold patrons are also permitted free entry for one accompanying guest. However, all patrons can receive year-round benefits that are not enjoyed by non-patrons. Having said all that, I would now like to announce some very special news. Next year will be our centenary celebrations. It's hard to believe it, but the museum was founded over 100 years ago. Accordingly, we will be seeing in the new year in style with a special masked ball. This has been organised in response to a special request from some of our patrons. Plans have yet to be finalised for this one-off event, but a themed masked ball has been suggested. The idea being that guests come in the guise of famous artists, past or present. One exciting event that has been confirmed is the Summer Garden Party. We are anticipating a lot of interest for this one, so it's best to book well in advance. Whilst the tickets are by no means cheap, we like to think that the price reflects the quality of the event. Amongst the many treats we have in store for you is a live orchestra playing in the museum's gardens, which are to the back of the main building. It is weather permitting, of course. Again, we are dependent on good weather in order for the barbecue to take place. Alternatively, a sit-down meal will be provided in the Cowl Room. Everything from the entertainment to the food is included in the ticket price, so there are no hidden extras. Now, having given you a roundup of the highlights of next year's social events, let's go on to the artistic highlights of next month. Coming up shortly is Ewan Bailey's newest installation, Light and Sound Waves. Always thought-provoking, his previous installations have been very well received. We will also have Hamish Barnes here for the first time as artist in residence. He will be encouraging visitors to adopt a more hands-on approach to art. Finally, last but not least, we will be exhibiting the work of Sean Long, who will be making his artistic debut. His work will be on show in the Warburton Gallery over the summer period. We are anticipating a large attendance at his exhibition. Well, that's all from me. I look forward to seeing you at one or maybe all of our events. It's certainly going to be an action-packed year for the museum, both culturally and socially.
That is the end of section 2. You now have half a minute to check your answers. Now turn to Section 3. Section 3. First, you have some time to look at questions 21 to 25. Now listen carefully and answer questions 21 to 25.
I think I've said enough, so now it's the turn of the audience. Would anyone like to start the ball rolling and comment on anything I said earlier in my talk? That young gentleman over there.
Hi, my name's Jake, and I've got a question for you. You referred to outsider art as being the work of self-taught rather than trained or professional artists. Does that mean anyone can produce art, then?
Well, what we define as art will always remain subjective, but given that we can agree more or less on a common perception of what is actually art, then yes, anyone in theory can produce art. The challenge, though, is to produce good art.
Excuse me, may I ask a question, please?
Yes, of course. Would you like to introduce yourself to the audience?
Sure, my name's Lucy.
So, Lucy, what would you like to ask?
Don't you think that untrained artists lack the necessary technique to produce good art? I felt that some of the paintings by outsider artists that you showed us earlier were, to be honest, rather crude.
I think you're confusing technique with art here. A great technique doesn't guarantee great art, you know. But I think impressive art can still be produced by gifted artists lacking in what are accepted as basic art skills. OK. Can I have another question from a member of the audience, please?
Hi, I've got a question. Oh, my name's Dave, by the way. I just wanted to ask, how many outsider artists were or are recognised in their lifetime?
Relatively few. The exceptions are the ones who create particularly monumental or significant works of art, like Nekshan's sculpture garden in India, or Ferdinand Cheval's fantastic building, the Palace Ideal. Both, as you know, were created purely from recycled materials.
Yeah, they were pretty amazing. I remember them from the slides you showed earlier.
But what impresses people most is not so much the sheer scale of these buildings and sculptures as the work involved. These artists built their work single-handedly over many years and, more to the point, in total secret, as they lacked planning permission. That adds to the romance of the whole undertaking, don't you think?
Well, their work certainly impressed me.
Yes, outsider art certainly produces work that is one of a kind.
Before you hear the rest of the discussion, you have some time to look at questions 26 to 30. Now listen and answer questions 26 to 30.
That was a really fascinating lecture.
If a bit gruesome.
Well, the Ratcliffe murders of 1811 certainly had a significant impact on English society at the time. It wasn't just the fact that innocent parties were involved, or that 2 households were brutally murdered that provoked public outrage and hysteria. The murderer, or murderers, since there may, as you know, have been an accomplice, invaded the sanctity of their victims' homes to commit truly horrendous crimes.
An Englishman's home is his castle, right? So I guess no one felt truly safe in the comfort of their own home after that.
Exactly. That's also why burglaries, too, have such a profound effect on their victims. It's often not the loss of valuables or possessions or even the inconvenience that upsets a victim most, but the fact that their conviction of being safe in their own home has been severely compromised.
But public hysteria broke out too, didn't it? Because there was a feeling that public safety was under threat. It was felt that the localised police forces at the time were inadequate.
Very true. The police force at the time had limited power. They could enforce the rulings of a local magistrate for the county, but they had one huge disadvantage.
There was no communication between county police forces, was there?
Yes. Details of crimes committed within a county were not shared. Obviously, when a criminal crossed county borders, they could often successfully evade capture.
Today, that seems so absurd.
Nowadays, with information instantly accessible to all police forces nationally and worldwide on police computer systems, yes, it does. But don't forget that it was only with the formation of London's Metropolitan Police Force in 1829 by Sir Robert Peel that criminal records could begin to be consolidated on a national basis. Even then, some areas outside and even within the Metropolitan Police District remained beyond the jurisdiction of the Metropolitan Police Force.
Were the Ratcliffe murders a bit of a wake-up call, then, to the crime-fighting forces of the time?
More than that, they acted as a catalyst in the formation of the Metropolitan Police. The public, too, played no small part in bringing about the much-needed shake-up in the policing systems of the era.
So the Metropolitan Force was founded over half a century before the infamous Jack the Ripper murders.
Yes. However, in spite of the force's best efforts, the Ripper remained at large. Many suspects were put forward, though, ranging from children's author Lewis Carroll through to artist Walter Sickert. Despite the notable failure to deliver justice on this occasion, the Metropolitan Police Force could not be blamed for any inadequacies in police procedure. In fact, the creation of the Metropolitan Police Force was a turning point in English law-keeping.
That is the end of section 3. You now have half a minute to check your answers. Now turn to section 4. Section 4. First, you have some time to look at questions 31 to 40. Now listen carefully and answer questions 31 to 40.
Now, I'd just like to refer to health and safety procedure. This is essentially to fulfill basic health and safety requirements, since I know that you are not unfamiliar with such procedures and must know them off by memory. Okay, so firstly I'd like to say that if you are undertaking any project, whether supervised or not, all of you will be required to discuss it first with your health and safety coordinator. In certain cases, written approval is required. The health and safety coordinator has the final decision in situations where formal approval is needed.
Everyone undertaking a project will have to first submit a form of a written standard operating procedure to the Health and Safety Coordinator, outlining the steps and justifications for the experimental process to be carried out. Should the undertaking of a project not be granted initially, plans for the project, if satisfactorily amended, can be re-presented to the Health and Safety Coordinator for approval at a later date. Assuming acceptance of the undertaking of a project, strict laboratory procedures must be adhered to. Overalls and non-hazardous equipment can be kept in the large storage room. On no account can either laboratory clothing or samples be removed from the building itself. Obviously, the same goes for equipment that is portable. This way we can ensure that no cross-contamination can occur with samples or specimens kept in the laboratories. Finally, and this goes without saying, when hazardous materials are being handled, full protective equipment should be worn. Safety goggles and protective overalls are kept in the small storage room for this purpose. If using sharp, contaminated objects, such as needles, these can be temporarily stored in clearly marked containers on your laboratory work surface. However, they must be disposed of by the end of the day in the waste disposal bins clearly indicated outside the laboratory building. These bins are to be found just outside the exit by the small storage room. In the event of fire, please make your way immediately to the nearest of the two exits, either by the small storage or large storage room that I pointed out earlier. All that remains for me to do is to welcome you all to the company and wish you good luck.
Hi, Mark. Are you going to that lecture on microchip implant technology? I don't think I'll go. It's not that it's not a relevant field of study. It's just that it isn't personally relevant to me. If it were a computer science lecture, though, I wouldn't miss it for anything.
I know. Still, I think the concept of microchip implants is rather intriguing. Whether you like the idea or not, such a technology opens up so many possibilities. Almost everyone stands to benefit from it.
It just sounds so futuristic and like something out of a sci-fi novel to me.
Funnily enough, microchip technology was first predicted in a sci-fi novel over half a century ago. More amazingly still, the prediction didn't fall far short of reality either.
But what sort of person would implant a microchip in their body?
Oh, I don't know. Gadget and techie enthusiasts for one. Whilst we may not have the technology available at the moment to use their full potential, they will have uses in many fields in the future, I'm sure.
But doesn't the implantation of the chip hurt at all? I'd imagine it was quite painful.
Actually, from what I've heard, it's relatively painless. All you feel is a slight prick on your skin as a needle with the chip is inserted under your skin.
Just the thought of it makes my stomach turn. But isn't it quite unsightly? Doesn't the chip show up as a bump on the skin's surface?
No, not at all. It's really minute, you see. It's so small it fits into the size of a thumbnail.
Well, it's certainly not my thing for sure.
I think you ought to come to the lecture, though. You might change your mind.
No, you go. If you find out anything interesting, then you can tell me. I'll be around on campus for at least the rest of the afternoon.
OK, you're on.
Great. We'll meet after the lecture then. See you.
Bye.
That is the end of section